right, well, welcome. One thing just want to mention up front that this is next generation CHROs, not crows. We're not going to be doing a session on aviation or aviary species and genetic change in that particular group. But we are very excited to talk about CHROs and what we see as some of the leading developments in development of Chief Human Resources Officers. I think it fits very nicely with the General's discussion on leadership, because we're really talking about leadership within the HR function and how do you develop and grow leaders within HR. We have a panel, actually Mike is part of a panel, it's called the Human Capital Leadership Council, that is focused on asking various research questions for us as consultants. We're with Aon Hewitt, the global risk and people consulting business. And one of the key questions they had was, we're having a really hard time both, maybe not so much identifying, but actually moving people internally from HR roles into CHRO roles. We often find, and these are companies, typically Fortune 500, some of the biggest companies that you think would do a pretty good job around succession planning and developing HR leadership. But one of the things they find is that even where successors are identified, for various reasons, they're not actually approved to move into that role. And that there's a large number of people that are coming externally and from outside the HR function. So what we want to do is dig into that and say, why is that happening? What are some of the things that companies could do better to create more of a sustainable pipeline of people that would be ready for CHRO roles? It's not to say that everybody within HR, it's like not everybody within the C-suite wants to move to CEO, but obviously for many people within HR, there's a question of, I'm very good, as a functional leader or as a business partner, what is it that will take for me to move into a CHRO role? So what we'd like to do is share a little bit of the research that we have with you, and then Mike Johnson, who is been with UPS for many years as head of HR for a 400,000 employee organization, is going to talk a little bit about his perspectives, and then we'll make sure we've got a little bit of time for questions at the end. So as part of this study, we interviewed 45 heads of HR across many different organizations, averaging about 26 years of experience, and asked them a number of questions about what their perspective on the future CHRO role, how's it changing, and then how should HR professionals prepare themselves to become CHROs of the future. One of the things that we see, from a quantitative perspective, is that the CHRO role, and these are for organizations with about $2.5 billion in sales or more, is becoming, and is over a number of years, been a very important role. The average compensation, this always gets people's attention, for these roles is $1.5 million a year. About 40% of that is a combination of cash, so that's base plus incentive, and the rest of it is equity. And it has been growing quite dramatically, as you can see from this chart. In fact, it's now somewhere about the fourth or fifth highest role within the C-suite. So, it used to be that you often did not find that top HR role even within the C-suite. It was reported to below, and now it's typically one of the top roles within the organization as part of the C-suite, and compensated very well for that. But also happens to be one of the riskier positions. I think, Neil, we found it was like the second role that had the shortest tenure. So many people move into the role and then leave for various reasons. And part of it, as we saw, was people moving from company to company, but also very, very difficult position. One of the things we did see is that people, particularly when CEOs leave, they often, the CHRO leaves because of the trusted partnership between CEOs and CHROs. We went a little bit into the background about what is it that really creates effective CHROs, and what is the kind of background that people have. And we found that over half of incumbents in CHRO roles are not career HR professionals. And there's many of them that have had a combination of various roles, including business roles, and Mike's going to talk more about that. But there's one of the things that is quite important, I think, is that diversity of experience. So how people learn and grow and develop by taking different roles across multiple, sometimes in consulting, sometimes line roles, sometimes other staff roles, COO roles, or in some cases even we've had a few people that were in CFO and CHRO roles and had been in both. And one of the things that we see as we talk to clients and to CEOs is there's increasing point of view that CHRO roles prepare yourself for CEO roles. And we've starting to see some movement from CHRO to CEO. If you think about the fact that for most of the companies here and most of our client base, over half of the value, sometimes 70, 80% of the value comes from people, human capital versus other capital assets. It's obviously clear that CHRO role can be very much a role that would prepare someone for a CEO role. Now, one of the things we saw too was, this was the point that our clients made, was that across this sample, and this is, I think we've seen this in other research, other groups, that 60% of the people were not picked internally. Only 40% of the successors for the CHRO role were coming internally, and 60% were coming externally. And many of those external people had multitude of experiences in HR and other areas, but that definitely leads to the question of why aren't there more internal candidates for that CHRO role, and what can companies do to better develop people to create more successors for that role. The only function that we see that has such a high percentage of people that are coming from outside the function is actually the CIO, the Chief Technology Officer, where you often see people that have worked in different areas. But all the other areas, you tend to see people coming from within the organization. And then we asked, what is it that really, and this was looking across the research space we did, what are some of the key attributes of people that are moving into the CHRO role, both internally and externally? The number one thing we really saw was diversity of experience, that having multiple experiences, in fact, the risk-taking aspect of being someone who's willing to try different things, and this can be anything from someone, and some organizations like IBM have done a very nice job of moving people within HR, between an HR business partner and a chief functional officer, whether it's a talent or rewards officer. But then also where people have been encouraged to move between P&L roles, where they've got responsibility for business P&L and HR. And there's some organizations, Pepsi is actually one of them, that does a very nice systematic approach to supporting people in their development of movement and the ability to take different roles and be supported by the organization. And I think that's probably the big thing we see, is that organizational support. Obviously, individuals have to take a risk, but they want to know that there's organizational support for it. So that diversity of experience, there's, out of our group of CHROs that we interviewed, almost no one moved directly up, where it was, okay, I started as a generalist and moved up. It was taking various roles to prepare themselves for that CHRO role. Global was a key thing. A third of the people had actually lived and worked outside their home country. And almost all of them had some level of global experience, whether it's being on leading global task force, spending some time outside their home country, but that overall understanding of what the global challenges and how you prepare yourself to operate and grow with a global company was critical. And then the other thing that was quite interesting, we weren't expecting, was that there's a real premium with this group on changing industries. So we actually found, you can see on this slide, that out of this group, that the highest percentage of people had actually switched industries 3 or more times. And we were kind of digging into that because, you think, okay, if you're in financial services, you might want to stay in financial services. If you're in tech, you might want to stay in that. And what we actually found out was that the C-suite and the CEO valued that diversity of experience and bringing perspectives from different industries, because many times, if you think about a sales executive or marketing executive, many times also even finance executives, they tend to stay within an industry, and most of their careers built within an industry. But when it came to the CHRO, that ability to bring, okay, listen, I saw this particular talent challenge in the tech field. How does that then, as we're trying to build out more technology capability within financial services, how does that relate? And there was a real advantage to having that diversity of experience when it came to gaining that top role. So it's definitely some interesting things. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to Neil Shastri, who led this particular study, to go into some more insights, and then we're going to ask Mike to provide some perspectives from his own personal perspective.
Thanks, Pete. So what we noticed was when we looked at these 45 CHROs and we looked at their background, we said, hey, was their context the same or was it different? And no wonder, it was different. But what was really different? So we saw three kinds of backgrounds. So I wouldn't say there are three kinds of CHROs, but there are three kinds of contexts that a CHRO may step into. And what they need to do then depends upon what context they're entering into. And it makes sense to keep this in mind when you're thinking about your position as a CHRO or even as an HR business partner, because there might be different levers that you want to pull depending upon what your context is. So the first context was what we called founders, because these were people who were entering a situation where HR either did not have a seat at the table or, because of historic reasons, didn't have any credibility. And typically what you would see these CHROs do is to pick up 2 to 4 initiatives and really talk about those, work through those. And the focus was really on execution and measurement. So the typical programs that these CHROs would pick up were around talent sourcing, around leadership development, and around organization and HR effectiveness. The second category was what we would call directors. Now, directors are those CHROs who have a seat at the table. The CEO and the board believe that HR adds value, but they believe that if the HR function was to work better together, break down its internal silos, it could really add much more value to the business. And so those are the persons that we're calling directors, because their role is really to align, to optimize, to really streamline the operations of HR. And so what these CHROs tended to do was to really look at creating a clear strategy and plan to say, this is what I'm going to do, get that sign-off from the CEO and board, and then really work hard towards breaking down silos within HR. It could be because you have very different units, and those HR functions have been very fragmented, but really streamlining them and bringing some sort of unity in the way that they're really working. So one of the common phrases that we heard was one HR. I'm sure that a lot of you are working on that as well. Now, the third kind were CHROs who were stepping into a situation where the organization itself was undergoing a major transformation. Now, the transformation could be because they were going global. It could be because they were diversifying into a different industry. It could just be that the entire business scenario had changed. And these CHROs really were more like business leaders with the responsibility of HR, and that's how they ran their functions as well. So they run their functions as if these persons are consultants who are working and grouping around a problem rather than specialists in a particular area. Now, what we noticed was interesting because these transformers were also focusing on leadership and on talent sourcing and selection. And so we said, are founders and transformers essentially the same thing? Then we clicked a little deeper to see what did they actually do. The reason that founders are focusing on talent sourcing and selection is because that is the biggest HR process. It's the most visible HR process. It touches everyone in the organization. And this is a great opportunity to show an ROI on what you're doing. On the other hand, what you have on the leadership is because you have exposure to the leadership by doing leadership programs. The transformers are doing the same two, or are touching the same two programs, but for very different reasons. The reason that they're looking at the leadership process is because the CEO is really expecting them to be an agent of change and bring that alignment in the leadership towards change. The reason that they're focusing on talent sourcing and selection is because they're expected to infuse a new set of ideas through the people that are coming in rather than stick with the older fold. So you might look at the same program as a CHRO, but might have a completely different outcome that you're trying to drive. We asked these CHROs what were the key functional and behavioral competencies that they required, because we are HR consultants, we like asking about competencies. The competencies that you see over here are really a reflection of what they were expected to know. The one that I want to call out is the executive compensation, because this is a little bit of a chicken and egg story. Because a lot of CHROs told us that this was one of the most important skills that they required when they entered the role. But this is often the skill that most second level of HR persons do not get because they are not exposed to the board. And so what's tending to happen is, because CEOs and boards are looking for that skill, there is a certain set of CHROs that is circulating rather than new talent getting infused into this pool. And so the way that companies are tackling this is really by giving some sort of exposure to high potentials within the HR function, to get them in front of the board on things like succession planning, on things like executive pay, so that they can actually get the experience of working with the board. The top 3 areas of investment, we asked them, what were the areas that you invested in when you first got into the function? If you see these ones that we have up there, if you think about talent sourcing and selection, you think about leadership assessment and development, you think about organization and employee effectiveness, there is a common underlying thread, and I think the other speakers during the day have talked about it. The role of HR increasingly is becoming to think about talent and talent management as a holistic field rather than thinking about it piecemeal in terms of, hey, I'm going to go and source a few people and this is the TAT that I'm looking at. No, organizations are really looking at, am I getting the right people at the right time, at the right cost, but are they performing 6 months down the line, or have I made a mishire? And they're moving to the stage of really thinking, how is it that I can predict that somebody is going to be a mishire rather than feel like 6 months down the line, I've made a mistake with hiring someone. So with that in mind, what are some of the skills and the trends that future CHROs need to be prepared for? Everybody talks about analytics. Everybody talks about data. Right? People analytics, data is the most frequently talked about topic in all HR forums. But it's not about data, it's not about the systems, it's really about asking the right questions. And so therefore, again, the mindset comes into play in terms of really thinking about what is the questions that I should be asking on the back of my data. I think the other interesting thing for us was really about the organization culture. Now, there are various views about what is the role of HR, whether it's a driver, whether it's an architect. It's a driver, it is an architect. But what we heard quite clearly was that culture is something that is the responsibility of the CEO and the C-suite together. It is not just the CHRO's responsibility. But where the CHRO is expected to play a role is to be an objective third party assessing whether the organization is actually undergoing a culture change or not, typically at the leadership level, and be very objective about it to say, hey, these are the 3 persons in the C-suite that may not be in alignment with the culture change that we want to get to, and therefore need coaching, or in the worst case, need to be replaced. I think the other part that I just quickly want to touch upon is really the one in the middle at the bottom, which is about preparing the organization for disruptive business trends. Today, this business trend, which is disruptive, is technology. You hear everybody talk about technology. But really, technology is a trend, and it is the trend that's disrupting businesses today. What we heard these CHROs really talk to us about, which is the theme of this conference, is really building their organizations to be agile, to be thinking about tomorrow and thinking about things differently than they have been taught in the past, and getting people who are able to adapt and who are agile and who can change and adapt to a new situation without really feeling bogged down. The charting organization-specific strategies is also important because one of the things that you often hear HR ask about is benchmarks. Hey, tell me, what does Google do? Tell me, what does Facebook do? But you really need to think about whether that is relevant to you. A Google or a Facebook are great firms, but they hire the 99th percentile of talent. They pay for that kind of talent because they have those business results. You have to ask yourself whether you have that kind of talent, or is your talent different, and what is it that your talent requires, rather than aping the strategies of other firms. So with that, I'm going to leave you with some thoughts about what HR needs to be thinking about as it thinks about the future. The first thing is really about thinking about growth, because this is what your organizations are focused on. Your organizations are focused on revenue growth and profitable growth, and the only way that they're going to be able to get there is really by getting your entire leadership team to have a collective ambition for growth. And that is the central role that the CHRO can play, because not only does he or she lead a function, they also are the conscience keepers of the organization and can say whether this collective ambition is being cascaded or isn't. The second is really about preparing yourself and the workforce and the organization for black swan events. If you've not read the book, this is about events that you could not have predicted. You could not have predicted that this would be, or last year was the coldest winter, but this year, oil companies could not have predicted it be such a warm winter. But it was, and that means certain things in terms of the cost of oil actually not mattering because nobody is using that oil. So thinking about black swan events, not from the point of preparing for them because you can't by definition, but really preparing your workforce to build around them is critical. The intersection between the CIO, the CFO, and the CIO is going to become, and the CHRO is going to become critical as you go forward. Because these are the three functions that can work together and actually bring about organizational change. Working across different generations, talent pools, but really not thinking about this as an inclusion agenda or a diversity agenda, but as a business agenda. We're working with a client in the banking and financial services who actually have been working on the D&I program for a decade and more. But what they have now decided to do is to actually use that same ERG that they had around generations to give them feedback about what is it that customers are going to be buying from the millennial set. They're looking at really seeing how they can target their products towards the LGBT population. Really thinking about your enterprise resource groups as business resource groups and thinking about how you can bring them into your main fold in terms of strategy is critical. The last thing I'm going to leave you with is a lot of your organizations work with customer data. But you need to think of your people as consumers, because now you actually have data and the technology to talk about the experience that you can make targeted towards one individual, or a mass customization that matters to a group of individuals who have similar needs and wants. So use your data, start thinking about your employees as customers, because you finally can do it. HR has talked about it forever, but now you have the opportunity, you have the data, and you have the technology. But this is just me speaking. Let's hear from Pete and from Mike about some real-world experiences of what actually matters and makes a difference in HR.
Thank you, Neil. Appreciate it. All right, so we're going to, we mentioned we have the pleasure of having Mike Johnson join us. Mike was CHRO for UPS, over 400,000 employees globally with very long history and tremendous success in the industry. And now Mike recently retired just a few months ago, and he's now starting up and is the CEO of Johnson Talent Consulting. So he's going to bring some perspectives, obviously from UPS, but also some of his perspectives of being in the function and seeing a tremendous amount of change. And I guess the first question, Mike, is, and this gets at Neil's point previously about what is HR's role in business transformation? So thinking about the kind of transformation that UPS has gone through and is continuing to go through from a technology perspective, from a global competitiveness perspective, what is your perspective in terms of what role HR has played in helping supporting that transformation?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. And good to be here with you, everyone. You know, so I guess to put it in context, when I started with UPS, I just finished a 40-year career, so 1975. So think about what was UPS looking like in 1975. We were about a $4 billion company with less than 100,000 employees. When I left UPS a few months ago, we were over 450,000 employees worldwide, and we were just shy of $70 billion in revenue. So you can think about what kind of growth spectrum that was over that 40 years. But what you probably also can ascertain is that over the last maybe 10 years, the pace of the change certainly has accelerated. So think about it in real world perspective. So think about you as a consumer of using our services. When I was a driver some many years ago, and I could do that work, you would trust us with, here's your package. You give us a package, and then you just wait to get a phone call on the other end and say the package was delivered. But think about what happens today. When you take your package to the UPS store and you hand that package across the counter, the first thing you do is you go into your car and you get your smartphone out and you see where's my package? Well, it's still at the UPS store because you just gave it to the guy across the counter, right? But the thirst for knowledge and the visibility and transparency that the customer is demanding has really pushed us into being more of a technology company than a package and delivery company. And so where does that leave HR? So over that 40 years and then over the last, maybe 10 years, what we had to really rethink about in our context around how we were going to help the organization move in that direction was what kind of skill sets you were going to need, right? Because, you think about it, we were hiring basic laborers and then developing them through our internal development processes. Now we have to hire a lot of technology people. I mean, that's a big shift. What kind of skill sets do you need, not only to bring them in, but how do you retool your recruiting mechanisms to be able to bring them in and attract them to come to a company that they wouldn't typically see as a technology company is one. And then on a broader scale, the company's culture is one of promote from within. How do you make sure that's relevant to today's world where you have a lot of internal and external turnover of people that want to come in and give your organization a test drive and then move on? How do you hold on to the people that you want to hold on to and give everybody an equal opportunity to find a career path in the organization? Those are just two of many changes that I saw happen in HR. One was, again, is how do you look at your attraction model, your development model, and your retention models dramatically shifted over that period of time.
Great, excellent, thanks, Mike. And thinking about your development, because one of the questions that I think is very interesting is in talking to heads of HR for some of the largest companies in the world like UPS, Mike, is at what point in time were you thinking about CHRO, and was it a planful development for you, or was it more kind of just jumping into things and saying, okay, I'm going to try this and see what works, or maybe give us a little bit about your story?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you, the first day I walked into the door at UPS, they certainly said, hey, you're going to be the next CHRO for us, some 30 years from now. But I think, it starts with how your organization looks at development. And UPS, again, like I said earlier, we have a big promote from within culture. So we still believe that we can take people and give them the wide range of experiences, the wide range of rotations and development. And then we have a pool of people to select from for opportunities. So my early career, and this is what I think is very important in thinking about CHROs even into the future, is I spent the early part of my career in operations. And I think it gave me a foothold on how the business operated. What was the mechanics behind how we did our work, how we made our money, how do you drive a P&L? And you did that from the frontline level all the way up, much like other companies, all the way up through supervisory roles, mid-level management roles, et cetera. And then at some point, through career development, my opportunities to say what I'm interested in, the organization's opportunities to say where you may have an opportunity to help us and continue to develop, I kind of put myself on a pathway into HR. And then I kind of carved a career path down the various opportunities and rotations to be developed and eventually move through the organization to run the function. But I will say that I'm a firm believer that foundationally, I think CHROs, whether they move from industry to industry and or they get developed within their organization, need to understand the context of the business so that they can best service the strategy that the organization is trying to execute.
Good, excellent. And Mike, was there a point where you said, hey, I could become a head of HR for UPS? I mean, what was the?
I thought I was ready early on.
Back 40 years ago, you were ready for it, right?
No, I mean, I think it's interesting when you think about the work and what is HR. And I was preparing for this panel. It's an interesting field to want to pursue. I think you have to have some curiosity about the work which we call HR, but fundamentally you have to think about what is HR, what is this work, and it's nuanced at best. It's not an exact science, and I think if you go on the websites of pick the Fortune 50 companies and go read about the backgrounds of CHROs, you're going to find they came from a lot of different places and did a lot of different things. Something about the work in HR fueled their curiosity and their drive to want to learn more about it. But this nuanced work that we do is really cemented in that we are trying to do two things, I think, in HR fundamentally. One is we're trying to influence behavior of people, right? Mm-hmm. So anything we do, whether it be training programs, development programs, rewards programs, healthcare choices, it's about influencing behavior. The other thing that's not widely known is that we're also trying to be a predictor of behavior. And I think those folks in HR that move to the top jobs become better at what I would say making better bets on, if I do this, this is what I think is going to happen. Right. And based on my experience and my knowledge, I can pretty well predict, here's where I think we're going to land if we make these kinds of changes. So the predictive analytics is not done with a lot of
right.
fancy
It's not
machinery.
All numbers. It's
a lot of it's done through learned behavior of how people react to change.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you, Mike. Appreciate that. Mm-hmm. So we wanted to make sure we had some time for questions. So questions for Mike on some of his experience as CHRO, or questions about the study that you might have, the Next Generation CHRO study that we conducted. So let me just stop a minute, because I know there's been a lot of presentations so far, some fantastic ones. We wanted to just make sure you have a chance to ask some questions or to pose any thoughts you may have. Any questions, just raise your hand. One right over here.
Yes, I'm curious if the study looked at all at the impact of education on these roles or not, or how varied it might have been.
So the role of education in becoming CHRO. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Neil, would you comment on that?
Yes, I mean, we did look at the background of these CHROs, and we looked at their educational background. What I would say is that we didn't see a big trend in terms of whether they were, PhDs, or a lot of them were masters, but, had got their masters, I would say, 15 years into their career, mm-hmm. rather than really, started their career with that. So, so I think the background was broad. You did have people coming from completely outside of the function as well, who had nothing to do with HR. So in fact, 1 in every 6 CHROs that we interviewed actually came without a background in HR at all. So.
Good. Other questions? Over here.
So my question is more about just the study. In the slide, it talks about the CHRO, the CFO, and the CIO, and why those 3 roles are integral in kind of driving organizational change, why those 3 have been identified.
Yeah, and I'll start off, and Neil can jump in too. And Mike, please, from your experience, because UPS is a great example, mm-hmm. we see that more and more business decisions are really are made around the boundaries of different functions. It's not a pure people decision or a human capital decision. It includes technology. You're moving into new technology. Do you have the right capabilities? What is the technology? How are we going to finance it? How do we build the business case for it? So where we see some of the most effective, and this actually goes to a current study we're working on around companies that are top quartile growers, has been where those 3 functions particularly work hand in hand. It's not the CFO in the traditional way say, no, don't spend any money. HR is always about spending money. It's really about building a case and really thinking about the intersection of those 3 functions to drive change. I don't know, Mike, anything from your perspective?
2 things, just practically how it works is that if you think about a business, there's always 2 things at play, and the third piece I'll pull in, but the 2 things at play always is, do you have the capital to be able to execute what your CEO or your leadership team or the board is asking you to think about? Capital, and then capability, which is the people side of it. So do I have the capabilities, do I have the capital? And what's underpinning everything today, if you think about it, is technology. And so in our organization, we have to be very disciplined about where we're going to make the investments for the technology spend, because everybody that has a business challenge and a solution has a technology price tag to it. And so if you allow everyone to come to the table with, let's just spend the money on that technology solution, you could find yourself in a strange place. So, having those three voices to help kind of think that through helps you to kind of get clarity around where you want to make your investments. And the other piece I'll add, if you remember last year, maybe some of you saw the article, because it was the front cover scared everybody that was in HR, was on Harvard Business Review. It's time to blow up HR. Everybody bought all those magazines and hid them from their CEOs, right? Does anybody just read that? But when you read the articles, they were surprisingly more bullish about the opportunities for HR than it was about HR should, be put on the shelf. And one of the articles, if you haven't seen it, you should go read, is the one Ram Charan penned, which was really about the story and the journey of how finance people became CFOs. Because CFOs were not always in place. They weren't always CFOs. And the journey that they took, and the CEOs putting them in that position of really being their right-hand person about the kind of capital decisions that need to be made to be successful in executing your strategy. And he was being a big proponent that the CHROs need to be the other side of the sandwich, so to speak. So it's a good article, a good read, and I think it helps maybe explain a little bit about what you're getting at there in your question. So.
Great, excellent. Thank you. A question back here?
Yeah, just a question for the panel. What kind of pressure or how are companies dealing with multinational C-suite positions? Are you hearing pressure to be filled from different countries for these, where they do business, for these roles?
Yeah, so, Mike,
I'll start out. I mean, it's a challenge. I mean, so I'll give you our story, and I say that affectionately because I've only been retired a month, so I still call it our story. But once a UPSer, always a UPSer. So, if you think about it, we were a company that was founded in the U.S. Our first international expansion was actually in 1976, and that was up in Canada and in Germany. We kind of went both places the same year. And that was pretty much it for a number of years until the 90s when we really started getting, I think, aggressive with expanding into Europe and then around the world. So now we're in almost 300 countries, worldwide. So when you think about what does that mean from the talent development model and how the succession planning process, still today as we look at our senior level team, we still don't have somebody on the team, I think, that's actually started with us internationally. We have people at very senior levels, but we haven't gotten somebody on the executive suite that's gotten there yet. And so that's one of the things that the CEO, both CEOs, the one that just recently took over, Dave Abney and Scott Davis, have talked a lot about is, how do we not only make sure that we put some accelerant behind that, but it's really the right thing to do to get the right balance in the decision making that you're looking for your organization. So all these companies that are kind of U.S. based and then have this kind of counterbalance between having development opportunities that really ascend everybody to the senior levels and being a little more swayed by kind of the U.S. centric model is really, I think, an area that needs continued focus and attention.
Yeah, and I think it just one very recent experience for me, kind of underscoring Mike's point, is one of the clients I've worked with over the years, a company called Mass Mutual, almost 200-year-old, very U.S.-centric traditionally, now expanding globally. But they just brought in, as their CHRO, someone who is Australian by birth, worked in the UK, and spent a lot of time in the Middle East from a different company, right? So someone not within Mass Mutual, they felt that they needed to bring in a very different kind of perspective to balance out their C-suite. So we definitely see more and more of that, of looking at that mix of the executives and say, how do we create as much diverse experiences so we're really learning and building upon each other?
It even challenges things like where do you want to house what you call your corporate office? I mean, if you think about it, traditionally, most organizations have a corporate, campus or a corporate office. Could be domiciled in the U.S., but it really challenges, your thought process around that. Do you really need to have, a setup that's only in the U.S., because we have regional offices around the world, or do you need to, could you have a virtual setup and allow people to live and operate out of the countries that where they're from, and then connect back into the corporate entity? So there's a lot of dynamic there to wrap your head around. So.
Great. Well, it looks like we're just about at the time, so I wanted to thank very much Mike for joining us.
pleasure.
Neil, too, and we'll be around over the next day or so, so if any questions you have, let us know, and I'll turn it back over. Thank you.